Well, as world leaders continue to take to the podium at the 80th United Nations General Assembly, today saw impassioned speeches from both Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy as well as French President Emmanuel Macron, each delivering pointed messages on global security, sovereignty, and the urgent need for multilateral cooperation. And in the coming hours, Nigeria's Vice President Kashim Shettima is expected to address the Assembly, marking a pivotal moment for Africa's voice on the world stage, particularly around economic justice, UN reform, and regional security.
Right, joining us live now from the United Nations headquarters in New York is Adefemi Akinsoya, Arise News International correspondent who's been closely following today's high-level debates. Adefemi, so good to see you. Now, what's the latest from inside the General Assembly? I do recall that Volodymyr Zelenskyy, Ukrainian leader, actually made very, very impassioned address today. What was the reaction to that?
Good evening to you, ladies. It's always a pleasure to hear your voices. But yes, absolutely. If we're talking about the highlights of the day, one after the other, world leaders have been taken to the podium at the iconic United Nations General Assembly, this great debate, this general debate, and delivering their remarks on the state of the world. You mentioned Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Let us start there. He made an impassioned speech today, earlier this morning, where he talks about what he is describing as the most destructive arms race in human history. Hard-hitting words, of course, relating the invasion of Ukraine by Russia to an example of the eroding norm of the global order ongoing, essentially saying what is happening in Ukraine being perpetuated by Russia can happen to any other country, is vulnerable of happening to any other country if we don't stop and take stock and really do the needful when it comes to securing borders and making sure that these countries remain sovereign ones. So that was definitely going to be the lion's share of his speech. We couldn't imagine that Volodymyr Zelenskyy would say anything else when it came to his turn on the podium. We did also, ahead of today, bump into the Ukrainian president. He had a closed-door meeting with some journalists. I was able to find myself in the room and listen to the conversations being had there. And during that conversation, he had just ended some form of a meeting with US President Donald Trump, but he was very adamant that he wasn't going to share the particular details of that meeting. That being said, Donald Trump, his usual talkative self, did shed some light on what they discussed, that being the prospect of some land being returned to Ukraine by Russia. Now, on its face, it's very difficult to see how that could be so, because even in the aftermath of that iconic meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump in Anchorage, Alaska, there hasn't been any real follow-through on that. Certainly not both of these leaders, that being Vladimir Putin of Russia and Volodymyr Zelenskyy of Ukraine, sitting down and talking to each other. It does seem as though the rhetoric continues to be that Ukraine is willing to talk, but clearly that's just not something that is on the purview of Russia right now, especially when they're making demands such as, Ukraine ceding the land that's already been taken. This is something that Ukraine has repeatedly said it cannot do, it will not do, and even if it did want to do it, this is something that the people of Ukraine would have to decide within a referendum. And this is very interesting here. If we could just over my shoulder, we can see that we have the Saudi Arabian delegation walking in just behind me there. It does look as though you have the Crown Prince just walking in, and this is the magic of the United Nations, essentially. You will be standing on the street and a literal world leader will walk past you. So that was the Saudi leader just there coming up. But going back to the conversations about the general debate and what we've been hearing, Volodymyr Zelenskyy clearly is looking for as much support as he can. This is, of course, against the backdrop of a lot of world leaders shifting their attention to Gaza and what we're seeing in the Middle East. That being said, we did also have the likes of Emmanuel Macron, the French president, come out and, of course, talk about the need for multilateralism, the need for more unity. And this is, of course, happening against the backdrop of the United Nations General Assembly, which theme is that of unity. Ironic when you're looking at the level of degradation when it comes to, the coming together of countries. There is seeming to be conflict on every corner. So with Emmanuel Macron, that was definitely his speech, and he wanted to go some way really to kind of shift the narrative after what was an explosive address from Donald Trump just yesterday. So, I mean, when we're looking at the world debate, this is definitely something that we can expect, what countries are going to say what, and definitely in the lead up to the general debate, in the lead up to high level, we knew that more countries were going to recognize officially a Palestinian statehood. That's something that we did hear within Emmanuel Macron's remarks, and we can expect that other world leaders, when it is their turn to address the crowds, the likes of the United Kingdom, Canada, Portugal, New Zealand, will continue to do the same, because as it stands now, it does look as though when we're talking about the spate of conflicts around the world, there is just no appetite for them. But ironically so, despite there being no appetite for war, there continues to be more and more examples of conflict. So that's really what we were seeing in the lead up to what has already transpired at the general debate today.
Yeah. Wow, thank you so much, Adefemi Akinsoya, for keeping the tabs for us there on the what I like to describe as the very hectic diplomatic speed dating at the UNGAD 80. But let's and well done. Let's talk about what's to come. We are told the Vice President Kashim Shettima, representing Bola Tinubu, is scheduled to speak sometime today. Tell us, do we know when exactly that will happen, and what should we be expecting from his speech?
Thank you, Adesua. So yes, you know, they break these sessions down into a morning session and an afternoon session. So we already knew that Nigeria was going to be represented in the afternoon session, which started around 3 p.m. local time. Now it goes one after the other. So from the beginning of the afternoon session, which was 3 p.m. local time, 8 p.m. Nigeria time, we knew that Vice President Kashim Shettima would be addressing the United Nations in 15th position. He'd be the 15th speaker. So the approximate timing is that he would probably come to the podium at around 8 p.m. local time, which is clearly going to be around 1 a.m. in Nigeria. I mean, it's not ideal, because you can imagine that there are countries who would want to be listening to their leaders represented at the general debate in quote-unquote better time, in a good time when people are likely to be awake. But this is the hand we've been dealt when it comes to the timings of this situation. But going to your question about what he's actually going to talk about, it's very likely that he will talk about the need for economic justice, debt relief, debt reform, definitely better articles when it comes to the state of corruption around the world, how it negatively hampers, the idea and the image of Nigeria. Of course, conversations about the return of illicit funds, but really and truly, he will likely discuss the environment too, the importance of the environment, and then we cannot skate away from the issue of security. Now, I've been able to speak to the Vice President twice in 2 days. When I spoke to him yesterday, he did talk at length really about the need for the United Nations Security Council to have 2 permanent seats go to Africa, and Nigeria should absolutely get one of them. He said that this is not even a conversation of Nigeria begging or asking for this. This is something that is a rightful need. He talked about how in the future the lion's share of populations would be represented by people of Nigerian descent, and this is something that should be reflected in a council such as the United Nations Security Council. So again, it kind of juxtaposes against what we heard from Donald Trump. He talked about how the United Nations is really irrelevant, that they don't do enough, that they don't have a lot of action. And on the other hand, you've got the likes of Vice President Kashim Shettima clearly having a lot of respect for the institution. It's been 80 years of United Nations, and Nigeria is definitely one that appreciates, respects the United Nations, but clearly has a lot of words to say about about security. Earlier today, I mentioned that I had spoken to him yesterday, and I also saw him today. There was a meeting with the African Union members talking specifically about security on the continent, and it was very interesting to hear the Vice President's remarks. He spoke quite powerfully about how there needs to be a greater push towards democracy, that is something that Nigeria continues to prioritize. And when you hear the likes of other countries represented in the room, the likes of Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo's president Felix Tshisekedi was in the room, Joao Lourenço of Angola actually hosted the meeting. You did have the Tanzanian president Samia Suluhu represented by a minister, but very, very high level politicians and presidents in the room, clearly all of them very interested in making sure that Africa becomes a safer place. They talked about how we get to solving a conflict and celebrating immediately that a resolution has been made, that a ceasefire has been called. But then often you find that the ceasefire breaks before the ink is even dry on the paper. So this is clearly another example of the world really fragmented. Very, very tense, very quick to fight. But you do have the likes of Nigeria and other African countries saying that this is not how things should be. And so I can imagine that Vice President Kashim Shettima, when he does take to the podium, will talk about the importance of unity, of coming together, of prioritizing democracy and democratic rights for the people of Nigeria, of Africa, and indeed around the world.
Absolutely. Adefemi Akinsoya, the world needs peace now more than ever. Arise international correspondent there at the UN 80 for us. Thank you very much and well done, Adefemi.